words, he's a film historian. This is sabotage. Thank you. Okay. In his words, he's a film historian, curator, broadcaster, and consultant. In addition to his books on the films of Michael Powell and Emerick Pressburger, Terry Gilliam, Martin Scorsese, he has contributed chapters to editions like Stories We Tell Each Other, The Cultural Impact of British Film. In 1994, Ian Christie wrote and co-produced a television series on a BBC series on early cinema and what led up to it, The Last Machine. The book, The Last Machine, is available from the BBC Educational Developments.
No longer.
No longer.
You can still find it on there.
Well, on Amazon, I checked it. It was, but I think that there's a second-hand thing. Yeah.
But you can find the TV series on YouTube, I'm glad to say.
On YouTube, so that's great news. That's great news. And his research interests range from Russian cinema to the digital revolution, from early cinema and the history of screen entertainment in London. To be more specific, I see he has a long-lasting interest in Robert Paul, an enigmatic figure in the early film history in Britain. And this interest can be traced in, for instance, in his Domitor blog post, and also there's a DVD, I think it is still available, which came out from BFI. In addition to his extensive publication list, I mean, I cannot, list his books or chapters, it's impossible. But one thing one notices is he uses various media, alternative ways of, disseminating film culture and early film history. And as a matter of fact, I visited Ian last month in London, and he showed me this wonderful, amazing graphic novel, the first 2 pages of graphic novel on early film history. I mean, this I find very fascinating and very. I'm very much impressed by it because his passion for making early cinema available, accessible for a wider public. This is, what is important, and I find this very valuable. And this is an example that others should follow. So please give a warm welcome to Ian Christie.
Do I need to speak close to a microphone?
It's working.
Do I need to? Maybe I could use that one. Sitting down after we've just been watching Gustav's wonderful film, for me to sit down, you have to sit down, but I don't have to. So, if I can, you can hear me okay? Okay, thank you, good. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's very exciting to be here, and so far the conference has been very, very rich and very full. I hope I'm not going to lower the tone. Can we reduce the light a little bit on the screen? Is that possible? Do you have selective lighting? It just seems a bit unfortunate to flood the screen with light. Anyway, the short answer, of course, to the question that I posed in the title, why do we need film archives anyway, is really to do the dull, boring bits, the bits that nobody else wants to do. The looking after film, big cinema, has been done for a long time by people other than film archives. Film archives have usually been the repositories of the film that nobody else wants. And I will explain a little more about that. If you want the great classics of cinema, most of you go to the studios, or maybe to television companies, or video companies. Very often you do not go to the archives, because very often the archives do not have the great classics of cinema, which is another story too. But the truth of the matter is, of course, that we're also looking at the general background to this and to the whole conference is that most film is lost. These are figures that are normally used. We normally say 80% or 90%, but that's just a guess, an approximation. Basically, most old film is lost. Occasionally there are stories about great discoveries. And one of our discoveries, for instance, in Britain, although I think it's known in other countries as well, was the collection of Mitchell and Kenyon films. Mitchell and Kenyon was a very, very, very obscure regional film company in Britain in the early part of the last century. They were so small that they were invisible. They only operated in the Midlands in Britain. There were many regional film companies, of course, all over Britain and in other countries too. And almost all of their films were lost until somebody discovered in 3 milk cans an enormous collection of films that had been pushed into these and had survived. Because actually nitrate film often survives very well. Really often better than safety film. And under the right conditions, it can survive. And so, by a miracle, the Mitchell and Kenyon collection was found. And at a stroke, we had an enormously larger number of very early films. It increased the total number that we had in Britain by many hundreds of %. Of course, they're not typical in any way. These films are not at all typical. They're simply what a small film company that was trying to make its way in the market produced. So it doesn't give us any sense of what the general run of films were in Britain before 1910. It just gives us that little snapshot. But it's a great project because it led to a whole series of books, a BBC television series. It really opened up the world of early film through this very narrow optic to a much wider public. This was done by Vanessa Toulmin, the head of the Fairground Archive at Sheffield University. So it's a very, very important example of how you can bring early film to a wider world if you have a story to sell. And the story is the discovery of these films. But of course that's like a fairy story. It doesn't usually happen. So there's no point in thinking that early cinema will survive by means of exceptions like this. For instance, I've been working for the last 20 years on Robert Paul, the man who actually invented cinema in Britain. You've never heard of him? Wait until my book comes out next year. Unfortunately, he was written out of film history at a certain stage, but it's clear to me, and I think to some others too, that he really was the inventor of cinema as we know it in the late 1890s. He was certainly extremely influential in many ways. He produced about 800 films from a studio, big distribution network that spread his films all over the world. We only have about 75 of his films. So this is quite typical, I suppose, of the survival rate of his films. For instance, the films on the right there that are advertised. This is a film about the Russo-Japanese War that he made in 1904. He made 3 films about the Russo-Japanese War, all lost. Unless you look at his catalogues, you can't tell that he made films about topical events. But he did, many. We only have 5 photographs of him. He was not a self-publicist. That's one of the photographs. It's a very interesting photograph because, can you see the wires on the side there? Does that mean that he was using an electric camera? I think it does. This would be very surprising. This is a photograph from 1897. We know nothing about electric cameras in 1897. So was Paul, who was an electrical engineer, was he actually using an electric camera? Yes, he was, because he writes later that he shot a film and the camera was running automatically during the event in 1898. So this is an example of how looking at the evidence, this photograph, can lead you to ask interesting questions. We don't know the answer yet. So for instance, as I look at Robert Paul, and this is an working example of the kind of problems of rediscovering the past. This is from a catalogue where he made films during the Boer War, the British War in South Africa, British Empire War in South Africa. He realised that the films he was shooting in the Transvaal were not very exciting because everybody had to be too far away from the action. So he started making reproductions of typical scenes from the war on a golf course in North London. These were all lost. When I started working on Paul, we had none of them. We just had this page of catalogue. But by talking to people in archives and by looking in the farthest corners of the empire, New Zealand actually, we began to find some of them. So there are now 3 of these films are known to exist. But the problem is, would an archivist in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, would they know what it was if they found it? Not necessarily. So you have to mount a big campaign of information to archivists and motivate them to want to look at films which they've never looked at, which could be anything. So we know that Robert Paul's films were made in colour, were coloured right from the beginning. There's an advertisement in 1896, the first year of cinema on screens, which says, living colour. Do we have any colour films by Paul? Absolutely not. Not a single frame exists of his coloured films, and yet they're advertised as the main attraction in 1896. These were hand-coloured by the people who had coloured lantern slides. Very slow, very expensive, but worth doing. The showmen were willing to pay for these very expensive prints because they knew that that was the attraction. So cinema was in colour in 1896. There are lots of producers doing it, but you would not guess this from the kind of film history that we discover normally. That is probably the only surviving frame of Robert Paul in colour. That's a film of two frames of Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1897. This huge spectacle which was filmed by 15 different companies from all around the world. They sent cameramen to London. Paul filmed it. I was summoned to the National Film Archive in Britain 4 or 5 years ago. Very exciting. A piece of film had been found that was in colour. And I photographed it with my camera one-handedly as it disappeared into a test tube, never to reappear, because the emulsion is leaving the acetate. So the film is immediately stabilized, immobilized, and will never be seen again. But I have this photograph, so I know what it looked like, and my proposal is that for next year, that we will actually artificially colour some of Paul's footage to show what it should look like. This is very similar to what Gustav did, for instance, in adding sound to mute films. I think we should recreate the sense of what these films would look like And that's the DVD that Nezid mentioned, which you can still buy if you're interested. Now, the only large collection of early film that exists is in fact the Lumiere Catalog. And this, I think, is of course very interesting and very valuable, but it really has distorted film history enormously. There are some 1,400 Lumiere films, which were all reassembled for the centenary year, for 1995, and their restoration was paid for by the French state at vast expense. They were catalogued, correctly identified. Many of them have been misidentified. There are three reasons why the Lumiere Catalog has survived almost all completely intact. The first reason is that they had a system. They sent their cameramen out all over the world. They had to send a copy of the film back to Lyon. So they actually had copies from a very early stage. The second reason is that they actually left the film business very early on. They were not part of cinema. They stopped making films in 1903. They really had stopped by about 1900. So actually they belong to the prehistory of cinema. They're not cinema, in my terms. They're making very simple films which mostly last a minute from, of course, the wonderful topography of the world. But essentially they belong more to the history of the end of Magic Lanterns than to the beginning of cinema. And they never made any fiction films. The third reason why they survive, of course, is because the French state has invested massively in the myth of Lumiere as the founders of cinema. And enormous resources have been put into this. Banknotes, postage stamps, universities are named after them, streets are named after them, and the cost of restoring the films. But, and this takes us to another theme, but can you see the Lumiere films? Try seeing them. Well, what you'll find is that they're very difficult to see because they're actually still privately owned. The Association Frères Lumière copyright. The great-great-grandchildren of the Lumieres claim copyright. This relates to what Tadeu was talking about. This on it. And French copyright is extremely complicated. There are 5 different kinds of copyright in France. And there's a peculiar thing called the droit de succession. You can actually claim copyright for the descendants. And the Lumiere, Association Frères Lumière, headed by Bertrand Tavernier, has jealously guarded these films and tried to keep them in copyright, so that the world has never had access to them. And in fact, the only DVD, 2 DVDs have been produced. One was done in America and is therefore regarded as a pirate DVD by the French, although it's narrated by Bertrand Tavernier. That's the best way of seeing them. And then recently a version, a very small selection, has been produced by Thierry Frémaux, the head of the Institut Lumière and the head of the Cannes Film Festival. And actually you can only show Lumiere films if you invite Thierry to come and introduce them. So it's very corrupt. What I'm saying is these films, the films made in 1894, 95, 96, should be freely available to the world. And they're a very interesting collection of films. They are not freely available because of absurd copyright restrictions, which are particularly French and have largely obstructed the circulation of the films. So what Tony was talking about yesterday is very, very relevant to understanding the problems that archives face. There is now, for the first time, a catalogue of Lumiere films online. Those are the two DVDs that you can actually get hold of. That is the exhibition that was held in the Grand Palais in Paris 2 years ago, celebrating the Lumieres. So, I want to move on to the question of the relationship between film and history, which I think is an underlying theme of this event. And traditionally, in film studies, most people would point to, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, would point to the work of a very obscure Polish cameraman, Bolesław Maciejewski, who was a court photographer in Russia, Russian Empire, and he published 2 pamphlets in France in 1898, a new source of history, calling for the creation of an archive, a collection of films, which would be, he argued, a new source of history. Nobody paid any attention to Maciejewski whatsoever. He has been rescued from history because these pamphlets exist, but no one acted, of course, on what he proposed. Why would they? He was a nobody, he was only a cameraman, and nobody was going to collect films. But actually somebody did propose it before Maciejewski, and guess what? It was Robert Paul. Robert Paul did most things first, I've discovered. In 1896, first year of cinema, when he was producing dozens of films, he wrote to the British Museum and said, maybe you should consider collecting animated photography. I could give you some copies. The British Museum didn't answer him. We now know that the British Museum looked at his letter and said, what is this? What would we describe them as? How would we classify them? This is an important question. What would you call animated photography? Is it a document? Is it a print or drawing? What is it? That's why they didn't answer him. He made a fuss in the newspapers. There's quite a lot of reports about it. Stephen Bottomore wrote about this when he discovered the correspondence. And Paul actually sent them some films, but they lost them. So that, in a sense, could have been the beginning of collecting films as historical documents. This is an early film by Paul, for instance, one of the earliest, Royal Train. That's the original nitrate, which I was just looking at a few weeks ago, which is preserved in the National Film Archive in Britain, but it's not preserved in the British Museum. So the problem was, for early film, that the pressures that drove the film industry, that created the film industry, were entirely dedicated to not preserving film. The biggest problem that the early producers faced was that people would buy a film, keep it, and keep showing it until it collapsed. So the film industry, the film trade, in most countries devoted all its efforts to trying to stop people going on showing old films and selling them new films. This is a very important dynamic. So old films were considered to be the enemy of the trade, and there were many campaigns to stop people using them to sell them new films. And this is one of the reasons for the low rate of survival of old films. There was, not only was there no encouragement to preserve them, there was an active discouragement from preserving them. For instance, this is a famous case in British film history. Will Barker, who was a very dynamic producer in the early years, Will Barker was desperate to do something to promote his most expensive new film. So in 1911 he produced Henry VIII, the beginning of the British love affair with the Tudors on screen, which continues to this day. And so Herbert Beerbohm Tree, one of the great actors of the period, appeared in the film. But the marketing device that he adopted, that Will Barker adopted, was to say, I will destroy this film after 9 months. Every copy will be burnt. So book it now. Book it fast. And actually it worked. It worked in both senses. People did book it. It was a considerable success. No copy exists. We have nothing except the ads and the press comments. There are cartoons appeared in the trade press in Britain showing a bonfire of copies of the film, because it was the most spectacular attempt to use the idea that the film would be time limited as a method of selling it. And I think that illustrates quite graphically just how much the pressures of the trade were towards selling new films. One of the most important dynamics of the film business, of course, was the spread of Pathé, the first multinational film company. Charles Pathé, incidentally, was a customer of Robert Paul, of course, like everybody was, because he was the only person you could buy projectors from. Charles Pathé created a fantastic structure based on a really important principle, which was reciprocity between different territories. So there were Pathé branches in just about every country in the world. And in most cases it was the Pathé branch, the local Pathé branch, that began production in that country. This has happened in Russia, for instance, in many, many other countries. Local Pathé companies were the dynamo of production. They sent their films back to Paris, the Lumiere model, and then they were titled and sent out to other territories. And you can see the slogan, the early slogan of the Pathé company is very, very significant. À la conquête du monde. Forward to the conquest of the world. They did, by and large, conquer the world of cinema, very successfully. And look what it says in that poster at the bottom. Comme nous, ils ont conquis le monde. Like us, they have conquered the world. So their advertising showing, you know, Romans, Napoleon, etc. It's a very militant strategy to capture the world's film industry. Did Pathé preserve their early film? Well, yes, to some extent they did. Pathé were not the most ruthless in terms of getting rid of film, of all the companies. And I want to switch to the question of the beginning, the belated beginning of film archives. Which is an interesting story. There isn't time to tell it all, obviously, but I just thought that we ought to, I don't think anyone has really discussed this during this event yet. We've referred to it, of course. These are the key figures, I would say, in the story. There's a trio who really are the leading figures, I suppose, in the film archiving movement of the 1930s. Film archives begin in the 1930s, essentially. In France, in the centre, Henri Langlois, the man who has been adopted as the kind of patron saint of archiving, who created the Cinémathèque Française with the support of filmmakers like Georges Franju and others. It was a kind of, very much a personal collection that Langlois started to make before he got the state interested in supporting it. In America, in New York, the new Museum of Modern Art in 1934 decided to have a film department, the first museum in the world to have a film department. And they invited Iris Barry, an English critic, and her husband, to come along as well, to be the head of the department. And that's the beginning of organised collecting by a museum, which is actually why the Museum of Modern Art has a fabulous collection, because they started early and they did it quite systematically, going out and buying films even, not waiting for them to drop into their hands. Ezra Ingram was the founder of the National Film Library in Britain, which was the British Film Institute's first attempt to gather classic films. And that started in 1935. So they all begin just around the same time. There's a very close grouping. In America, a much more flamboyant figure, James Card, started to create the collection at the what was then called the George Eastman House, recently changed its name, George Eastman Museum, which is the home of photography. It's founded by George Eastman, creator of Kodak. And Card was very much a buccaneer. He would go out, gather prints and bury them in the grounds of the mansion. They reckon they never found some of the things that he collected. They didn't know where they were buried. He was a very energetic, as you can tell from the photo, flamboyant figure, deeply knowledgeable about early cinema, like Langlois, certainly, but also not a man to follow the rules. And so there are extraordinary things in the Eastman House collection. Don't ask where they came from. So, the only producing company that actually had a systematic approach before World War II to collecting and gathering and preserving material was Disney. Disney is a very, very important studio for all sorts of reasons, of course. They were the first to adopt sound, the first to adopt colour, Technicolor, and the first to systematically archive their materials. And one of the reasons they did this was because Walt Disney worked out that their material, which was extremely expensive to make, needed to be kept for the long term so that it could be reissued at regular intervals. And Disney actually still follows the practice. They have a calendar stretching way into the future which predicts which year each of their films will be reissued. And if you try to buy a Disney film on video or DVD in the wrong year, you'll find it's not on sale. They're extremely systematic about this. They really have organized the whole future as well as the past of their company. And that's the only company that ever did this. The other companies, the other studios, only began belatedly to understand that they should preserve their films when television arrived. And there's some very amusing stories of how the major studios, Paramount, Warner's, etc., realized that they could sell their films to television, but only if they knew what they had. So for the first time they made inventories, and they employed armies of lawyers to establish that they actually owned the rights to the films they had produced. Eric Hoyt in Wisconsin has done some fabulous work in the archives showing how the first inventories of the studio's production were entirely produced by the need to prove that they owned the film to sell it to television. So that all really dates from the 1950s when the studios began to see a new market opening up. Now, of course, they've become super efficient at following due diligence and maintaining ownership, title, renewal of copyright, etc., as we heard yesterday in their material. But it's quite a recent discovery, and of course it's commercially driven. When I started to get involved in programming film in the 1970s, programming Russian film and the work of Paul Pressburger and others, putting together programs of films to show was extremely difficult. You had to have inside knowledge. If you went, for instance, to the Cinémathèque Royale Belgique, which is one of the great sources of Soviet cinema, presided over by Jacques Ledoux, one of the other key figures in early archiving, you would go into Jacques Ledoux's office, is looking a bit like this, and you would say, "Have you got," mention a film, and he would say, "Maybe." It was a test. You had to pass the test. You had to show that you were worth being told. There were no printed catalogues, there were no card indexes, there was no nothing. You used your intuition that they might have a copy of a 1931 Soviet film. And if you passed the test, you were accepted in and you could see anything. If you didn't pass the test, you had to leave. This is really what archives were like in the late 1970s, that I can speak from experience. If you wanted to produce a retrospective of, say, the work of Michael Powell, as I did in 1978, you had to have friends with influence. You had to have people like David Meeker at the British Film Institute who knew people who worked in television companies, who knew there was a print there. Don't ask where it came from, but we can produce a print. So there's a kind of underground network. And many of the prints that we showed in the 1970s and 80s actually came from television. Television had them for purposes of transmission, but if you knew somebody on the inside, they would lend you a print. That was the only way of getting access to most of the history of cinema. In the later 16mm, the rise of 16mm during the 1970s and 80s gave us access to new collections of prints. But again, that's another story. So when we did the program that I mentioned, Powell Pressburger Retrospective in 1978, which in a way started the wave of enthusiasm that has made the films extremely well known today. They were not well known in 1977 at all. That retrospective was pieced together from very obscure sources. And for instance, the equivalent retrospective in 80-81 at the Museum of Modern Art, that was largely supported by films from the private collection of the curator at a curator in New York, Bill Everson, who actually owned 16mm copies of many of the films, and he supplied them for the screening at the Museum of Modern Art. So I'm telling you these anecdotal stories to give you a sense that the modern world of apparently very organized archiving is really very recent indeed. Archives, certainly in the early period and right up until the 1980s, were much less systematic, less transparent, less accessible, and were largely built upon collections of material which had simply arrived. Nobody knew from where. And certainly it was not considered legal, because it's important to remember that essentially film companies have never accepted that archives should legally hold film prints. And that, to some extent, is true today. There is still a state of active tension between the owners of rights of films and archives. The owners of rights are suspicious of the archive. What will they do with it? Why do they have it? Will they let unauthorized people have access to it? And there is a state of considerable tension still exists. Studios would prefer to have their own collections under their own control, and by and large they do have today. And so the public archives and the private archives have a difficult relationship with those large rights holders. I mention this because I'm sure almost everybody in this room has either heard of, maybe even read, Jacques Derrida's essay, Archive Fever. It's impossible to write about archiving without mentioning Derrida. You have to do it to show that you're a member of the elect. This is a terrible book, and I want to just publicly denounce it. The number of students who I've seen misled by it is really appalling. It's a terrible book. Don't touch it. The problem is that Derrida, a very abstruse and obscure French philosopher, who certainly had no real involvement with film, he wasn't writing about film, he has a very mystical concept of the archive. The archive for Derrida is a source of authority. And one of the themes that runs through the essay is to be in the archive, not in the archive. The authority of the archive as a place where the ultimate truth, but the power, Derrida writes very well about power, the power of the archive is a theme that he's very impressed by. And that is really one of the subtexts of the essay. But film archives have no power at all. They can prevent you seeing something, but they have no power, they have no authority. Nobody goes to a film archive to say, tell us the truth about Turkish cinema, British cinema, French cinema, because how would the archive know? They're not that kind of organisation. They are accumulations of material. Most archives would like to have films which they don't have, but they can't find a way of getting them. More importantly, they have many, many, many films that they don't really want to have, but somebody has to look after them. This is where I started from. If you look at the contents of most archives, you'll discover that something like 90%, 95% of the contents of the archive are never requested for viewing. They simply sit there. It's largely non-fiction. It's anonymous. Nobody cares about it. It's what silts up the archive. Every archivist that I've ever asked what films are requested from you will say, oh, there are about 50 or 100 or 150. Those are the only titles that we're ever asked to see or to show. So archives are a very strange organisation, and I think we should question why all film collections have christened themselves archives now. Why don't we call them collections? It's kind of more accurate. Or museums, because many of the archives have taken on the role of presenting a history of cinema in a building or in an exhibition. So if we thought of them as museums or collections, that might be more realistic than thinking of them as archives. They are not archives, I would argue, in the Derridian sense of an archive. They are not repositories of power or authority. Even if we would like them to be, they aren't. In fact, we live in a situation today where the traditional function of the archive, that is the function of the archive from the 1930s through to the 1990s, has been usurped by some very important, essentially digital developments. The beginnings of VHS, video, was the beginning of a problem for the archives. If people could get access to films on video, why did they need to go to the archive? This was a serious problem for many archives. I remember going to the National Film Archive, my neighbouring department at the British Film Institute, in the 1990s and saying, you own the rights to a film called 90 Degrees South, about the polar expedition, the Scott polar expedition. And they said, do we? Yes, you do. It was given to you in 1933. Ah, I would like to publish this on video. Video? But then everybody could see it. They would steal it. No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. They would know about it. We eventually, and I did this through Dennis Doros, who was mentioned yesterday at Milestone Video. Dennis told me that the archive owned the rights, and he published it on video in America, I published it on video in Britain. And that was the beginning of the discovery of this wonderful film. It was the beginning of an enthusiasm for polar films. But I have to tell you, our own National Film Archive was bitterly opposed to the idea of putting it out on video, because they could see that if it was on video, people wouldn't need to go to the archive to see it. They could just buy it. That was the first problem. The second problem for archives, of course, was YouTube. I mean, I don't mean that archives are actively opposed to YouTube, although many of them probably are, but what they realize is that YouTube has given people the illusion of access to a free-to-use archive. And actually, it's much more than an illusion. There are many things that you can see on YouTube, but you cannot see in any archive, because private collectors have chosen to upload material to YouTube. And that has been really very interesting indeed in terms of destabilizing the concept of the film archive. What it shows is that for most purposes, most people are very happy to have a YouTube version of something. It's perfectly adequate. They're not concerned to get the best version or the most complete version. Any version is better than no version. Private collectors who are very suspicious of archives because they fear that if they give their material to an archive, they'll never see it again. And that has happened. They will often prefer to keep it and upload it to YouTube, but they know where their ultimate copies rest. And I can give you various examples of that, of things which are only on YouTube, but are not in any known archive. So those two factors have caused a real problem, I think, for archives in the last 25 years. One of the interesting developments, of course, in archiving has been the possibility of putting archives online. And again, this has caused a variety of different responses. Initially, archives were very opposed to it, and then some archives began to realize that actually it was a good idea. So, for instance, the Danish Film Archive, which I think is exemplary, puts all its early film online and invites people to look at it and to comment and to give them information about the films. It's one of the great examples what Thomas Christiansen has done to crowdsource information about what actually is in the films, and particularly on locations, for instance. We were hearing about locations yesterday. There's a busy traffic in Danish circles of people saying, yes, I know where that was shot, yes, I recognize that place, etc. So this is, I think, the Danish Film Archive has been perfect in terms of what they've done. The Smithsonian branch of the Library of Congress has put all early American film online, about about the Spanish-American War, for instance. They've done a terrific job on that. Then we have the Internet Archive, of course, which tries very hard to use fair dealing to put as much material as possible online, where there's no known rights holders. American copyright law is totally different from everybody else's, but then all copyright jurisdictions are different locally. So that's a good example, a shining example. And here we have the BFI. The BFI is the only archive at the moment, I think, in the world that is trying to commercialize putting its work online. So this is being watched by all the other archives with great interest. Can they make it work? Can the BFI persuade people to pay money to see archive films online? It's called the BFI Player, and I think the jury is out. They haven't released any figures yet. They do offer a lot of early material free, although often it's not in the best possible condition. But they're trying to tempt people into behaving like subscribers to a television channel so that they get used to paying to see material. It's potentially an interesting development. If other archives saw that it was working at the BFI, they would follow. So this is being watched in the archive world with great interest. And then I just want to touch on the question of local archives. And again, we've heard a little bit about this at various points. I mean, you have a situation in Turkey, I think, where you have many different archives and archival sources. This is true in every country. There are multiple sources. Having a single national film archive is an exceptional situation, in fact very rare indeed. But I think certainly from a British point of view, and I think we've seen some of the examples of that in Gustav's film, kind of collections that he's been using, local specialist archives have been the real innovation of the last 25 years or so. And they're marvellous, because they focus on a particular area. In Britain we have 7 or 8 of these. The Yorkshire Film Archive focuses in Yorkshire, etc. And I noticed that Gustav used something from the Northwest Archive, for instance. One of his key pieces came from the Northwest Regional Archive. In Britain, regional archives, local archives, led the way in terms of collecting amateur film. The National Archive had never been interested in amateur film. The local archives realized this was pure gold, and they began collecting it when nobody else was collecting it. And gradually, the National Archives have come to realize the importance of local film and of amateur film through the example of the local archive. So this has been a real innovation. And again, it was bitterly contested by the National Archive. I know, I was there. Who are these people? They're not real archives. Oh, yes, they are. But they're different from the National Archive. So this has been a really important development, I think. And we're seeing the fruits of it, of course, in production that draws upon this material. Television, of course, discovered in about 20 years ago, television discovered that it's the kind of material that is in local and regional archives that is much more interesting than what's in national archives. So an enormous quantity of television documentary production draws upon these smaller archives for a number of reasons. First of all, it's more personal, the material, it's more focused, it's more specific, and it's often in colour. Because amateur filmmakers were the first to use colour. From the beginnings of Kodachrome in the 1930s, amateurs were shooting in very high quality colour, and where that has been preserved, it's what television needs. It does not need boring black and white newsreel. The newsreels did not go into colour until much, much later. So there's a very interesting relationship between television and amateur film. We've had various series. Every country, I think, has had these. We had The Real History of Britain, again drawing very much on amateur and regional archives. And people like me and Nezi here have produced our DVDs to demonstrate the richness of local sources. I've seen Nezi's wonderful. That's one of my London DVDs based on local regional archive. Oops, sorry. And that's his wonderful DVD of Film of Amsterdam. which he gave me a copy of recently. And here I'm showing it in my new basement cinema, showing off. This is one of the first things we showed. So, television and DVD have been helpful, but I think an underlying dynamic which is very important is what I would describe as an audience-centered aesthetic. And one of the great shifts we've seen in film studies in, I would say, in the last 10, 15 years is a real shift away from production-based histories and aesthetics towards an audience, excuse me, centered aesthetic. Introducing notions of autobiography, which we saw in Gustav's film, and a new, what I would call a new localism. And that again is inspired by the existence of local archives. You can see how all of these come together to, in a sense, challenge the top-down image of the archive, the state archive, which collects the important films produced by the industry in that particular state. Here we're talking about a bottom-up approach, which focuses on the audience, on individual stories, and on the local. My colleague in Birkbeck, Katie Grant, has been one of the pioneers in introducing videographic criticism into film studies. So she said, why write an essay when you can make a film about your response to a film? And she has set up a peer-reviewed journal which deals with videographic criticism. And a wonderful website, by the way, Film Studies for Free, FSFF, is Catherine Grant's website, which I strongly recommend to you because it really is one of the great websites in terms of giving you new information. Film Studies for Free. So, I think, just very briefly, and I'm conscious of time here, I think I see a number of shifts happening within the framework of, the conceptual framework of film studies. The old days of talking about authorship and genre and national cinema seem to be very much the old days, although of course it continues in a sort of zombie-like way to still function. But I think just as localism and audience-centered aesthetics have entered the picture, so I think people are becoming more interested in space and place and topography, and understanding, as I say here, film as a part of a mapping system. Film maps the world. This is what I was saying in our discussion yesterday afternoon, in very interesting and important ways. And fiction film does it in its ways, so-called documentary film also does it in its ways. So I think we're seeing what I would call a spatial turn in film aesthetics, which is underway, but has not yet gained recognition in some quarters. And again, of course, the web has been very important in this. The fact that we can do all sorts of interesting things in terms of correlating, as we saw yesterday in the work being done on Turkish cinema, the fact that we can correlate actual places with their representation on screen using web tools is tremendously important, I think. So, the new localism in action, demonstrating to people in Istanbul, in London, in many other places, that the local is interesting. The local is more interesting than the national. In fact, the national is just a collection of localities, some of which are better known than others, is, I think, very important. And this is the kind of work that we're doing with our London Screen Study collection in London, trying to get people to think local about even a place as big as London. I think, just to finish, the problems that we face in connection with access to archival film, the first big problem, of course, is how to develop discoverability. There is such an enormous quantity of material now available to us. How do we develop discoverability? Online discoverability and discoverability in online catalogues and search tools. Many archives now offer ways of searching their catalogues. That's a very new idea, but how do you search an archive's catalogue? How is it organized? How do you get access to it? These are big problems, and they're not necessarily being solved. Thematic approaches, I think, are very instructive. And I would put most of my faith in thematic approaches. I think using the old grids of date and place, date especially, and names are kind of useless because we don't know the names. So I think thematic approaches have been, are, and will be the way forward. For instance, the Library of Congress, which has done some wonderful work in this area, has got a whole collection of thematic groupings. You know, buckaroos in paradise, ranching culture in northern Nevada. You wouldn't know where to begin if you did it by names, but you do know where to begin if you do it by following a theme. So that's exemplary. We have some examples in Britain. We have various thematic strands through the London Screen Archives network. For instance, the London Blitz, Britain at War, which takes us through a whole collection of different material, all classified under different headings, but the theme is London during the Blitz.
Multimedia then, the hits?
Sorry?
Are the hits multimedia or just film?
Well, that's the problem. They're not as multimedia as they should be. The Library of Congress is much better. They bring together different departments. That's a very, very good point. Because we know that this shouldn't be confined to film. Film is often a very small part of it. Film is just the film component of a much larger theme.
The mutual context.
Exactly, exactly. So I think we're still in the early stages of producing genuinely integrative forms of indexing and thematic tracing. Yeah. So online access is not enough. I'm interested conceptually in bringing new techniques to bear on this problem of discoverability. And one of the things that interests me a lot at the moment is the field of attention economics. It's maybe something that people have heard of. It's often thought of as being to do with advertising. Well, it is, of course. The people who are very interested in attention economics are the advertisers who want a chunk of our attention. And the biggest battle in the online world at the moment is how to grab a piece of your and my attention. For how long? Very important part of advertising and PR. But we can use attention economics. I think we have to think in terms of what it is that attracts our attention, what draws us to, for instance, collections of archival film. And here, for instance, the example of the recent, and Ezra mentioned this in his opening presentation yesterday, the recent project developed between the Imperial War Museum in Britain, which is a film archive, and Peter Jackson in New Zealand, has resulted in this rather extraordinary film, They Shall Not Grow Old, which I gather is not yet accessible in Turkey at all. Well, it's multimedia in some places. It's, you can see a little bit of it online. I'm sure you can get some of it online here. Maybe just a teaser. It was released in cinemas. It was shown at the London Film Festival, and it was on television, on BBC television, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. Interestingly, the reaction of a lot of people connected with archival film was very negative. There's a big collection of people saying, it's terrible. Colouring, adding sound, oh, terrible. Not treating the archive film with respect. That means black and white, silent. That's treating it with respect. I think this is frankly rubbish. It's what got archives into a bad way. So I wrote a piece for Sight and Sound, a polemical piece for Sight and Sound online. This you can find online. In which I argue for this as a really interesting experiment that is going to bring archival film to a much, much wider public. And it's more than that. It's not just popularizing it, it's doing something new with it. It's creating a world, the world of life on the Western Front, using the resources of colorizing, of adding sound, carefully, intelligently, using digital devices to introduce us to a world that we really haven't experienced before. And I see, now having seen Gustav's film, I see a lot of relationships between what he has done with amateur film and what Jackson is doing with the Western Front. This is a subject we think we know, but we don't really know it until we see an immersive experience like this. So I think it's been a very interesting step forward. There's also something which I would call active archiving, which I've had some dealings with, which is really trying to take the archive into unexpected places. Instead of doing it in darkened rooms, why not do it in a darkened city? And we ran a series of screenings in Trafalgar Square in London, which is a fairly iconic location of archive film, with vast audiences. It requires a certain amount of funding, but it's quite successful in terms of breaking out of the boundaries of small, polite archive screenings. And I've also experimented with, this is a journey on a canal boat through London, where I did a series of presentations about London as seen from the canals, on the boat, as it were. There's a video of this online. So you can take archive film to unexpected places and do unexpected things with it, beneficially, I think. But, and this is my last point, of course, we still need to go back to the archive, sometimes, to trace the source of material that has been described, identified, but maybe misidentified. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting and least spectacular areas of archiving. This is me with Brian E. Dixon, the curator of silent film, in the BFI archive about 4 weeks ago. This film, which is called Footpads, is online on YouTube. It's in many museums. It's considered to be one of the most interesting early British films. It's confidently announced as 1895 or 1896, Robert Paul, Footpads. But I don't think Paul made it. And I think it's made maybe 5 years later. Nobody knows why it's called that and why it's attributed to him. The paperwork has been lost. We heard a bit about metadata yesterday. Nobody knows how the print arrived in the archive. That's the original piece of nitrate film. Could be a Paul film. Sprocket holes are right. But it could be something else. We have no idea. It's like a fragment of a piece of Egyptian antiquity. In fact, we know more about Egyptian antiquity than we know about many pieces of early film. There are only 2 or 3 people in the world who could give an informed opinion about the status of that piece of nitrate film. It's a very limited expertise base. And there are many things that we endlessly repeat because we've been told that they're true. And the internet, of course, amplifies the sense of conviction. The more repetition, the more people believe it's true. But if you try to get to the bottom of it, it is really a piece of archaeology. And there may not be a clear answer. I don't have an answer to this question yet. I'm working on it, but I don't have an answer. And we need to learn to be skeptical about identifications and assumptions that have been handed down to us. And I would like to say that for those interested in archival research, healthy skepticism is a very valuable quality. And I think, oh yes, I have to say this is the health warning. I'm under oath to say this on all occasions by Scorsese and Thomas Schoonmaker and others. You can repeat after me, digital is not a preservation medium, right? You know that, don't you? You really know it, but do you act on it? It's important to understand that digital is not only not a preservation medium, it's a a disappearing medium. Every time you store something digitally, it's losing pixels non-stop. Even if you put it on a powered hard drive, it's losing information non-stop. Continues to lose it. There are many shock horror stories from Hollywood of digital masters for very recent films which have simply disintegrated. There's nothing there. What is the solution? You can do one of 2 things. You can either make 3 separations onto black and white archive quality film and bury them in the ground, or you can migrate, migrate, migrate. You make as many copies as possible and then one of them might survive. But I think we have to educate the public to understand that digital is not a preservation medium. There are many people who should know better in important positions who have said to archives, it's all on digital, why do we need to give you money? Believe me, government ministers often think that, but it is not a preservation medium, and so we do have to preserve the acetate where it exists under the best conditions possible, and we have to be prepared to back up the digital material. So I think my recommendations are, I think we need to do two things. One is, we need a new reckoning on the legal status of digital images. And this is a large and complicated subject, but I'm just going to say that we need to have greater clarity on our rights as citizens to do things with digital images, on the limitations of ownership of digital images, and on the rights for reuse of these. It's a vast, and Claudia gave us an interesting insight yesterday into the complexity of this situation, and the fact that, of course, as everybody who's ventured into it knows, there is no case law to substantiate most of the assumptions that are made by the legislation that exists. So this is a very, very uncertain area. And of course we're all, in a sense, digital archivists today. We all have our own little archives, digitally, on our phones, on our cameras, on our computers, etc. We handle them with greater or lesser degrees of skill and foresight, but we all know something about it, because everybody in this room will have faced the problem of what to do about their digital photographs. Right? Do you know where they are? Can you access them? Are they backed up? So we all do have some first-hand experience of the problems of digital, changing formats, changing operating systems, all of those things, and we really should apply that to the wider field. We should use the personal knowledge we have from our own everyday experience, because we are, in a sense, all digital archivists. We're curators of our own collections of material, and we should use that to inform our practice in other fields. Those are some links which you might or might not find useful, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
So thank you, Ian, for this wonderful talk. I just want to make a very quick note about the digitizing the films. We can digitize the films, but we cannot transfer the data on the film stream. And they are very important to know the data on the film stream. Therefore, we need to keep them in the film strips. So,
can identify or recognize the sort of general drift of your talk. I think it's here and there a touch too bleak, actually. Because there were people, of course, as you know, I guess, that had a sort of an archival mind. I mean, the collection of Albert Kahn in Paris, who started to make films, photographs, or had them made and stored them and made sort of a whole system with contextual magazines and books and everything. There's also the initiative, I think in the early 19-teens, if I'm correct, to create a Danish archive, both of voices and images, which was sort of stillborn, but still, I mean, it was a brave attempt. But also, I mean, I now have a new word for that, because I didn't know we were doing that in the 90s at the Netherlands Film Museum, attention economics. But, you know, there was a policy at the time that to make out of a weakness of your archive a strength, because we had no classics at all, a few Dutch ones. But you know, I noticed, for instance, that when we started to preserve and show films from colonial Indonesia, that sort of drove also requests for that sort of material, and there was a large interest in it. The program that I once made drew a lot of attention, full house often. So it's also a matter of, you know, your own initiative, your own creativity. I mean, I did a study of 24 national or regional film heritage institutes around the world, and most of what they call curating is simply programming one film after another, and it's canonical, it's repertorial, totally unimaginative in most cases. I mean, I have a very bleak view in my own way of archives in that sense. But there are interesting exceptions. I don't want to go into that now. And it's also a matter that's also something of not my own experience personally, but in the archive where I worked in Amsterdam. It's also a matter of personal relations, because you know the American majors, the Warners and the MGMs, what have you, had their own offices in Holland, and we asked them to store their films because they didn't have proper storage. I mean, sometimes we got 8 or 9 or 10 prints of the same film, so I mean, it became a bit full. But the advantage was that contractually we were able that each of these titles we were allowed to stream 3 or 5 times a year, you know, with no copyright. So there's all kinds of possibilities to sort of get out of the mold that you were, particularly the contrast that you were drawing between public and private read studio archives. I mean, there are ways out, there are emergency exits, and the most important thing still, I think, is initiative and creativity and thinking out of the box.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm glad you offer those examples, because I'm trying to give a broad brush. The case of Albert Kahn is a really fascinating one, because Albert Kahn's films, I don't know whether people have seen them, Albert Kahn is a very rich industrialist who decided to document the world. The title of his collection is called The Archives of the Planet. Before it perished. And he had a strong sense that the deluge was coming. So before the First World War, he sent out photographers, cameramen, to record the world as far as possible in colour, using the Lumiere autochrome system for colour photographs. That archive has largely stayed untouched and to some extent unknown until the last 25 or 30 years, when people have started to use it. And there's a wonderful series which was produced by BBC Television, which you can still get on DVD, called The 30s in Colour. Fantastic series, using the Albert Kahn archive and many collections of amateur film, usually in a non-interactive way. But it's the absolutely pioneering example of using unsuspected sources to show us the world in colour in the 1930s, which we've never seen before. Great example. You can still buy it on eBay, I think. It's worth getting the VHS of it, or the DVD.
The statement you said, film archives, you said, are not authoritarian, or they do not hold any power. Is that true what you said? Okay, so I'm thinking, if we can think in this way, like other archives, film archives also may hold some films or visuals that were concealed, which would reflect the, I don't know, atrocities of the 20th century, massacres, so on and so forth. So, by not letting researchers accessing those resources, or issues related to accessibility and transparency, wouldn't you assume that this is in a way a reflection of power and authority?
I see what you mean, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well,
thanks.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they could be said to have power in terms of negative power, in terms of not releasing material. Yeah, that's true too. But I mean, they're not sources of authority, and I suppose if you read Derrida, he talks a lot about the power of the archive. And he's thinking about the traditional state archive of documents, basically, which contains the laws of the land and the texts which constitute the national narrative. In that sense, film archives do not have that kind of power or authority. That's not to say that, of course, by going into them, you can't actually release from them very important messages, very important evidence of things which are not suspected. Absolutely true. It won't only be from film archives that you'll find that, though. If you look at the work of Adam Curtis, the filmmaker, for instance, Adam Curtis has produced these extraordinary television documentaries using a range of sources. Film archives are only a small part of his source. He's using television archive, many other sources. The big agencies, the big news agencies, those represent sources of material. So I just mean that the traditional film archive, the ones that belong to the organization, the Federation of International Film Archives, that's not a source of power in itself. It's bringing together these different elements. And I think that's what's interesting about film, that if you want to make a strong statement in film, you have to go to many places to find the material. Certainly not one place, and it won't be the State Archive.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. My question is perhaps related to this. It seems to me there is an inherent contradiction in archiving in terms of purpose. I mean, one is to share and the other one is to preserve. And they seem to somehow in total contradiction. I mean, which comes first? There is a hierarchy between them. And from where you look at archiving, I guess the results changes. I mean, as much as you share the material you have, it deteriorates. So it's a matter of choice, I guess. And that contradiction is paralleled in, I guess, in the difference between digital and analog.
It is.
I
think you put your finger on something which is really important, and you've said it very well. When I showed you some pictures of the founding fathers and mothers, the way this used to be represented was these two figures, the two L's, Lindgren and Langlois. Ernest Lindgren, the founder of the British National Film Archive, believed that preservation was the most important thing. Never mind if nobody sees it, 3 screenings only, and then the print is forever closed, unless we have a negative. Very troublesome. I used to clash with the archive many times when I said, but I know you've got it in there. They said, no, it's had its 3 screenings, you can't have it. Langlois didn't care about preservation. And much of the stock of the Cinémathèque Française was destroyed over the years because he just didn't care. He would let it go out. There were many fires because he had stored prints in garages and warehouses all over Paris, very badly. There's nobody recording this, are there? I mean, you should. Okay. I'm relying on a bit of discreet censorship. You should be aware that the French state has got a huge problem because of the Cinémathèque Française. Many people all over the world think that the French archive is the Cinémathèque Française. It is not. It's a maverick organization, which because it's so well known, the French state has to continue supporting. But the actual French archive, the Service des Archives, is part of the CNC and is quite separate and follows correct archival procedures. And they're absolutely at daggers drawn, these two organizations. If you talk to one, you can't talk to the other, on the whole. So yeah, that symbolizes it. It's the Lindgren versus Langlois. Show it, show it, show it, or preservation. We're working for posterity. And you're absolutely right, digital has actually cut a channel through that. Because to circulate something digitally, digital is not a preservation format, but it is a circulation, an enhancement format, par excellence. It's really good at that. So we can do so many things with digital which do not touch or destroy or damage the original, if we can liberate it into the digital sphere. We just have to remember to make an archival copy of what we've made digitally, otherwise it may disappear.
I was also thinking in some cases, you know, following up from also Elif's question, remarks, this idea that the archive also releases certain material also is perhaps a statement, or at least, you know, it creates this idea that so the films we can see about Turkey, for example, from this archive are only these 2, and they're pretty, I don't know, I'm just making this up now, it's not what I think, and this might mean that it's completely apolitical. And the films that are released by another archive very recently might have to do a lot with the official history, and that also, you know, adds to this idea that what they preserve, or, you know, what they release and what they conceal sort of creates, you know, history.
It is.
And at the same time, I was thinking about your comments related to the spatial turn, new localism, and audience studies, and how these might all perhaps be related to the new grassroots movements that we get to see today in the world, and how perhaps, you know, a new archival practices that may emerge from not maybe activists, but, you know, from people with critical perspectives. So, for example, with another colleague yesterday, we were talking about, she has a film that I didn't have access to, and I have a short copy that I got pirately somehow, and she didn't have access to that. So we were thinking about exchanging these two films that we had, and, you know, in this way, perhaps an alternative, I don't know, would that be this local archival practice, and are there hopes to that?
Peer-to-peer. That's essentially what it is. I mean, remember, it was video that actually broke the logjam. In the end of the 1980s, when for the first time films escaped onto video, onto VHS, that was the beginning of a revolution that we're still living through. The fact that you can own a copy of a film, you can give a copy to your friend, you can make a copy of a copy. And that was the beginning of a new era. Archives have had difficulty, understandably, in dealing with that, for good and bad reasons. They are incredibly bound by, you mentioned, I think, didn't you mention the statistic about how little material most archives actually have any ownership rights in? That is the single most important thing to remember about archives. They have no ownership, virtually no ownership over the vast amount of material which they house. And they're petrified about having it taken away or being challenged legally by somebody who isn't the owner. It's a nightmare. So they are very restricted in ways which they can't control. And I think you're absolutely right. Peer-to-peer, new localism, active audiences is the way forward.
So two things. One is that I've always wondered, thank you for a fabulous presentation, I've always wondered why there isn't the kind of anxiety that we have over the original film or the original work of art, over the original book. And it's obviously true with indexicality and, you know, all that, so I won't go into that. But now that cinema is decreasingly indexical at all, I wonder if that has any bearing on the agenda of an archive. And the second thing is that, I mean, we are all, those of us who are working towards preserving film, are doing so with the objective that people 100 years later might be able to see them. And so this is a question about the idea of death, really. I mean, you know, does it have a death? So if one looks at cinema as, or film, as belonging within a long continuum of modes of communication, from oral to, you know, publishing and all this, I can't actually formulate my question because there's pressure on time, but I'm saying, what is the notion of longevity? And you yourself spoke about the spatial term. So is it circulation and the fact that we actually hold on to information or material for shorter periods of time, going back to sort of oral traditions where things change, you know, the story will change as when my grandmother tells it to me and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to look at it in that larger continuum. And I really like the idea that you propose of not calling a film archive an archive, because it carries a lot of baggage because of the etymology of the word. But why is a library not seen with that kind of suspicion, that an archive is, you know? And because we do have collections in libraries, and I think the terminology, as we all know, makes a lot of difference. So.
I favour the notion of collection myself, because I think collection is more kind of realistic and low-key, and everybody knows that collections are very, very diverse. And I think archive gives a false sense of centrality and importance to what are only collections of films. And you know, what Nico said just a few moments ago about how the Dutch archive realised that it could never compete in terms of having the great classics of world cinema, but realized it could do something else which was unique and valuable and accessible, which is show the colonial legacy, is really important. Most archives have not thought that way, but they should. They should think about what it is they're good for and what their collections are strong in. And this is what real collections in the real world do, you know. We're really good because we've got the largest collection, just this, or just this, or just this. So if we start thinking of them as collections, then I think we might have a more realistic sense of what they're good for and how they fit into the larger pattern. Because we're past the era of cinema. Cinema belongs to the past. We're far enough away from it to understand that cinema is just one phase amongst the larger history of communications media. Harold Innes, the great Canadian, actually put this very well. He took a very long view. All empires depend upon communications media. And of course his main pupil was Marshall McLuhan. So you know what follows from that. And I think the Harold Innes, Marshall McLuhan view is really the one we should begin to put film into that perspective. Hollis Frampton, a great American avant-garde filmmaker, called film The Last Machine. He wrote that back in the 1980s or 1970s. Film really is the last machine. So we're dealing with something that belongs to the machine age, but we're living in the digital age. I should stop there.
Thank you so much.